Hey everybody, this is Sean with Tab Performance. Today we're going to go through the installation process of a Tab Performance head pipe on an Indian Thunderstroke. If you guys like what you see, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, like us on Facebook, and follow us on Instagram. Alright, tools for this job. As far as wrenches go, you'll need a 22mm, 15, 14, and 13mm. A couple different socket drivers, 8, 5, and 6mm Allens. For sockets, you'll need a 1/4 inch, 5/16. That's used for the new hose clamps that we provide. A 13mm and a 15mm, as well as a 1/2 inch socket with an extension and a universal joint. Alright, step number one, we got to get the bags off. If you have a model that doesn't have bags or soft bags, you can skip this step, but on the models that do have bags, there is a wiring harness that is used for the electronic lock, so we got to disconnect that by taking off our side panel here. And this will be done on both sides. Once you get that off, then they move into the bag here. Holding on the bag are 2 bolts, 6mm Allen to get those out. Next, we're going to take off the mufflers. The process will be the same on both sides. First, we'll loosen the exhaust clamp. That's a 15mm socket. Next, we'll loosen the heat shield that holds the heat shield to the muffler. That's a 1/4 inch. And then there's 2 bolts holding it on at the back of the bike. Okay, so we'll go ahead and loosen the exhaust clamp first. Might be kind of hard to see because it's tucked underneath the heat shield. So if that's the case and you can't get a socket onto it, you have to take a wrench. Once we got that clamp loose, next I'm going to move the heat shield. These rears here require a 13mm. Once our 2 clamps are loose and our 2 bolts are out, next we can just come back and start pulling off the muffler. Be sure to hold on to that clamp because we will be reusing it. Same thing on the left hand side, we'll have our exhaust clamp and we'll have our hose clamp that holds the heat shield on. I'm going to go ahead and just take this one off right now. Just loosen this front hose clamp. Again, that's a 1/4 inch. And loosen the one in the back. Next, we'll go ahead and remove the rear heat shield. It's just a couple hose clamps. We've already loosened one that was holding it to the muffler. There's only one more up here on this rear cylinder. Just go ahead and loosen that. Next, we'll remove the cross under sections under here. We'll have a clamp here and then a bolt on the other side. 15mm. Use the bolt right in here, just take the 13mm, move this forward, and then you start pulling it down off of the opposite side. There it is. Now we'll move our right footboard. It is a 8mm Allen to get those 2 bolts out. Once you get those 2 bolts removed, you want to hang this from somewhere. You can either zip tie to the frame. I'm just going to hang it from a bungee. You want to hang this because the brake line is running through it, and if you just let it dangle, you might cinch that brake line. So just hang it from somewhere, get it out of the way. We'll come back to it later. Before we can take the head pipe off, we have to get our little covers off here. 5mm, 2 bolts holding each one of these covers in. Alright, last couple steps here before we can actually start to remove the hardware that holds the head pipe to the bike. I'm going to take the O2 sensors out now, and I'm going to do that just by unplugging them. The rear one is just right behind the rear cylinder, so it's very easy to get through. Front O2 sensor is right here. It's held in place by a zip tie, so just go ahead and cut that. You can unplug it. So I'm just going to start from the back and work my way forward. We have a bolt here that's holding it to the bike. It's a 13mm wrench. Back that all the way out. Now we have 4 more bolts, 2 per cylinder. I like to use a deep socket with an extension and a universal joint on there. Makes it a little bit easier to get through. Once you get those 4 nuts backed all the way out, I went ahead and loosened this clamp here just to make it a little bit easier to give myself a little spread on the head pipe to make it a little bit easier to get out of here. And we're just going to pull the head pipe off the studs. There she is. Alright, once you get the stock head pipe off, there's a couple different things we need to do before we can go ahead and put the new one on. We'll have to get these heat shields off. On the stock head pipe, the heat shields are held in place just by some bands, which you'll have to cut off with a pair of tin snips or some side dikes or something like that. Just get those cut off. When you get them cut off, you can go ahead and install the supplied hose clamps back into those spots on both sides. Again, so you'll take the head pipe off, cut the band clamps, put the new hose clamps in. Now with this head pipe, we are going to be reusing the stock front section of the head pipe. So with that, we do not need to remove the front O2 sensor. We will want to remove the rear one. And that's out. We'll go ahead and pull this front section out. With those 2 pieces separated, we'll take this clamp and reuse that.
Alright, now that we got the heat shields removed, we have our rear section, the TAB Performance head pipe, we have our front section, the stock head pipe. Now we can go ahead and get our O2 sensors reinstalled. The rear one does have a wideband O2 sensor bung. We're going to plug that with our reducer. Actually, we're not going to plug it, we're just going to put our reducer in place so that way we can use the narrow band O2 sensor in the wideband bung. We can get that started. This is a 22mm. Next, we'll take the stock clamp, put it over the TAB Performance inlet right there. Then we'll take the front section of the stock header. Just going to get that in place. We don't want to tighten this down yet, so that way we have a little bit of room to play back and forth and then in and out too when we go to put it up on the heads. So one thing to point out on this is the inlet here on the header where it meets the head is neck down. That way we can use the supplied conical gasket on the rear section as opposed to the flat gasket that comes on the stock head pipe. Just creates a little bit better of a seal in the rear section there because that's been hard to keep sealed. The front section is going to reuse the stock pieces. I'm just going to use the stock flat gasket just like that. If you need a new one, you can pick a new one up at your local Indian dealership. So I'm going to put these gaskets back in place. In flat ones, we're going to reuse that on the front section. And that should seat fairly easily. The rear gasket on the conical gasket that we supply, sometimes it is a little bit tricky to get that thing held in place long enough for you to get the header in there. It can kind of get knocked out as you're putting that in place. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to dab a little bit of high temp liquid gasket on the back of this, just so it can be held in place before I get the header in there. And when the header's in there, that'll seal everything up. Alright, my gaskets are in place, O2 sensors are in place, clamp is on there. You do want to make sure that clamp is on there before you get this installed. Next I'm just going to work this onto the cylinder studs. One tip about getting this installed is move this clamp out of the way so you can actually see where the front section of the header, how far seated it is into the rear section. If you can get this front section just so it's right on the edge of that notch, that'll give you enough spread to be able to just slide that right in there. And then when it's in there, you can slide it back, make sure everything's in position, and then move your clamp back in place. Now I'm going to reinstall the 4 flange nuts. Just thread those loosely back on to the studs. Alright, with those loosely installed, you can see here I can still move it around wherever I need to go. I'm going to take this bolt that we took out of the bracket right here and just get that in place, not tightening it down or anything, just getting it in place to hold this collector where I want it to be. So before you tighten those, just get this thing going first. Alright, everything's loosely in place. Next step is we're going to reconnect our O2 sensors. Just clip those back into their harnesses. Alright, now we can start tightening down our flange nuts. I'm just going to start in the front and then just kind of go back and forth until it's snugged up to the heads nice and even. Alright, one tool that might help you get these into place is this universal joint in the extension. It can reach behind the header and you can actually use that on that front one. If you don't have that tool, you may have to use a wrench on there because it is kind of hard to reach, but you should be able to get most of them with this guy right here. Alright, and that's on there now. One thing I want to point out, as I was tightening this down, I was just double checking spacing here, back here. I would tighten a little bit, make sure I was good. Go back, tighten it some more, and then just making sure my front section of the header is still fully into that notch there, making sure you can't see into the head pipe itself. So that's good to go. Those are all tight. Now we can move on to the next step. Now we can move on to this back bracket bolt. Now we can tighten our head pipe clamp. Sometimes this can be hard to just slide back over the bigger side, but all I have to do is take a screwdriver and kind of lift the notch over the lip of the head pipe. It should just slide right back on. You do want to be careful where you orient the nut, just because when you go to put the heat shields back on, if you get this too tight and it's hanging down too low, the nut might be in the way of the heat shield, so you just want to kind of about parallel with the ground. That's where I usually put it. That should give you enough room for the heat shields. Just tighten it with the 15mm.
Go ahead and get these heat shields on. When you put these hose clamps back in there, you want to put them in there so they're easy to access when they're on the bike. Put them on there and they're kind of facing the opposite way. You might not be able to reach it with whatever tool you're using to get it back on there. Let's just get these loosely started. And then I'll tighten everything back up once I get that rear heat shield on there. Next we'll reinstall our engine fins. There's 2 alignment pins on the front side. Line those up with the holes that they should be going in. Button those down with the 5mm. Another thing I want to point out too is if you don't have your head pipe properly seated at the heads, these engine fins will be difficult to get back on there. So if you can't get these engine fins on here, it's probably because you don't have the head pipe properly seated. Take them back off, make sure everything's square, then go ahead and reinstall the fins. To get this rear section on, you can just go ahead and put the heat shield on there and then tighten it down. I like to get the right hand muffler on there, because the heat shield does clamp over the muffler and it just helps me line everything up. So I'm going to go ahead and install that. That muffler on there. Next I'm going to take the rear heat shield and just start getting everything in place.
Now we're going to move on to the cross-under section, make sure that clamp is in place. Basically we're just going to slip the right hand side into our header. You do want to rotate it forward just a little bit and just slide it up onto the header, and then when it's up onto the header, then we can rotate it back. To where the bracket in the cross-under lines up with the hole in the frame. With that lined up, now we can install the stock bolt. Now we're going to just double check alignment on the left hand side with the muffler. Get that slid into place. Make sure you can get this in line with the bracket without having to fight anything. Once it's in line, then we can go ahead and install our bolts.
Now we'll move on and reinstall the floorboard. Okay, before we get the bags back on, we want to make sure everything's tightened down as far as clamps go. So I have the clamp for the cross under, clamp for the right muffler, and for the left muffler. Alright, that is all there is to it. Be sure to wipe down all your fingerprints off the bike. That way your fingerprints and or any grease or anything like that doesn't get burnt into the chrome. Also, our head pipe does not have a catalytic converter in it, so there's going to be a lot more air coming in and out of your engine. So you'll want to have it tuned to accommodate that amount of air, so you'll want to be sure to get it tuned for that as well. Other than that, that's all there is to it. If you guys have any questions, let us know, but thanks for watching.